Good evening, Hokies, and welcome. We are delighted to have you here tonight for our HokieTalks program. I'm Debbie Day. I serve as Associate Vice President for Alumni Relations. When we're together, we practice social distancing, and you will see that all of us also are wearing our masks. We stay 6 feet apart, and we wash our hands frequently. But we are all in our home or office at our own computers. And so I'm going to ask all of the participants to remove their masks now. I want to extend a warm Hokie welcome to all of the folks who are joining us this evening. And thank you for joining our fourth and final Hokie Talk of the season. We appreciate you being with us. The Hokie Talk program is to engage our audiences with faculty and their teaching and their research. And these are extraordinary faculty who are educating young minds and standing up for equality and racial justice in brave and meaningful ways. Tonight's Hokie Talk is in collaboration with the College of Architecture and Urban Studies, the Pamplin College of Business, and the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. We are honored to have Dr. Laura Belmonte, who is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, as our facilitator this evening. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Belmonte. She is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences and Professor of History. She received her AB in History and Political Science from the University of Georgia and her MA and PhD both from the University of Virginia. She is author of International LGBT Rights Movement, a History, and Selling the American Way, U.S. Propaganda and the Civil War. She's co-author of Global Americans, a Transnational U.S. History, and editor of Speaking of American Readings in U.S. History. Dean Belmonte, we know these issues around social justice are very important to you, and we're delighted to have you with us this evening as our facilitator, and I am going to now turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm delighted to be here. I'll start with a few housekeeping items. We plan to be with you for about an hour this evening. I will introduce each of the three presenters who will share a 10-minute Hokie Talk. At the end of the third Hokie Talk, I will facilitate a question and answer session for all three presenters. If you have a question during their presentations, please submit it through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We will get to as many questions as we can. Our friends in Alumni Relations will follow up with answers to any questions we are unable to answer during the session. As a historian, I pay a great deal of attention to echoes of the past in our present. And in recent years, I have been quite struck by the vibrancy of social movements and calls for social justice in the United States and elsewhere. Whether it is last weekend's demonstrations against anti-Asian racism and violence, or last year's Black Lives Matter protests, in which an estimated 15 to 25 million people in the USA and around the world participated. The women's marches, mass protests against anti-LGBTQI measures in Hungary and Poland, pro-democracy demonstrations in a number of places, including Hong Kong, the Philippines, Thailand, and Myanmar. There is no disputing that we are living in an era where people can quickly harness the power of technology and mobilize for social justice, even in extremely repressive societies. As a global land-grant institution, the Virginia Tech community is interconnected with these events through its students, faculty, staff, and alumni. It is therefore both a responsibility and a privilege to offer programming like this to help Hokies understand the origins, impact, and significance of the varied, passionate calls for justice for marginalized communities at home and abroad. I am very pleased that this evening's panel features three Hokies who are doing remarkable work to achieve these noble aims, who all exemplify ut prosum at its best. Our first presenter this evening is joining us on screen now. Dr. Brandy Faulkner is Gloria D. Smith Professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Political Science. Her research focuses on race, law, and public policy. She is an activist and organizer centering on racial and economic justice and is committed to cultivating community-based approaches to problem solving. She enjoys her time as an organizer with Virginia Organizing, joining hundreds of community members in grassroots movements across the state. She serves and trains national organizations dedicated to social and political change. By centering directly affected people, she has successfully worked with both institutions and individuals engaged in direct action, organizing, advocacy, and public policy development. Brandy's presentation this evening focuses on the role that power plays in communities. Brandy.
Thank you, Dean, and I appreciate everybody who is tuning in tonight to hear us talk about our work and how we center social justice. My presentation specifically focuses on an aspect of my community engagement, and that's how we understand, build, and use power in political movements. Frederick Douglass in 1857 gave a speech in New York about our duty to resist injustice. As Douglass began to talk about that ongoing resistance to immoral and inhumane systems like slavery and colonization, he made a very important statement about the centrality of power as people navigate social and political realities, make sense of their individual circumstances, and try to figure out how to change them. He said this: "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them." Now, aside from his rather depressing conclusion about the exploitive nature of humankind and by extension the state, he noted that we can effectively challenge injustice by directly confronting its power brokers, a core philosophy of political movements and especially mass movements. So in my work, I spend a lot of time examining strategies in political movements, especially race-based power dynamics and how these relationships affect self-efficacy. Now, self-efficacy is the degree to which someone believes they can produce a desired action or an outcome. How do people in movements conceptualize, build, and then wield their power? What I hear so often from people who are engaged in political movements is that they sometimes feel powerless. Many go on to describe their situations using common metaphors that indicate power imbalances. Trying to end the school to prison pipeline is an uphill battle, for example. In these narratives that are coming from the front lines, we can see levels of self-efficacy are initially quite low, but they can increase over time. But what causes that increase? Self-efficacy theorists like Bandura and Maddox have studied variables related to self-efficacy, things like performance feedback and positive mastery experiences, social persuasion, and those things are certainly important, but what, if any, effect does power have on these analyses? For years, there has been a significant public support for civic engagement, a big push for more spaces and opportunities for everyday people to have voice in and influence in public decision-making. But do communities believe they have enough power to act, enough power to improve their conditions for their families and for the people they love? Enough power to change policies and systems that affect their quality of life? In 2014, violent attacks on the Black community led to months of planned and sustained resistance in the form of some civic engagement, some protests, some demonstrations, some direct action organizing, and a surge in political activism. This is known as a red summer. It's a period of mass action in response to an attack. And red summers are a great time to observe levels of self-efficacy and also people's understandings of power, because there's usually a good mix of some long-term movement workers or movement OGs, as well as some people who are engaging for the very first time. So I collected some data on self-efficacy levels among movement organizers to see if or how it would change as communities navigated the many roadblocks in their movements. Across the 5 organizations I studied, self-efficacy levels increased as the communities moved from low to medium and then to high levels of power. And with one exception, this was true even when the campaigns failed, meaning they didn't reach their movement goals or objectives. And I'm seeing very similar patterns in the data I've collected on our current red summer, which began last April. What this tells us is that perceptions of power don't always match the reality of power. But it also tells us that community-based power building can positively influence individual self-efficacy. So understanding power is essential to our political work. If we misunderstand power dynamics, then we can make poor strategic decisions, for example, and we can miss opportunities to win the changes that we're fighting for. In fact, one of the key principles in social justice work is to alter power relationships so that communities are in control of the major decisions that affect their lives. So we are not just trying to achieve formal policy objectives, though that is important. We are fundamentally trying to change how people relate to each other. So what you see is a summary of the types of power relationships that we see in movement work: power over, power within, power to, and power with. Now, power over is the relationship that typically brings people into movements. It's the type of power concentrated in the state and in many institutions where authoritative hierarchies are maintained at the expense of human needs and care. It assumes an inferior-superior relationship. When individuals are affected by this often abusive type of power, they begin to look for a way out of that relationship. But we can also have power within, and this is often the starting point as individuals move towards self-efficacy. It develops from our own sense of self-worth, our self-knowledge, as we begin to imagine possibilities and see ourselves as valuable and capable and deserving. And then next, we've got power to, and it's the potential of every individual to shape their life and to make contributions to the world around them. The focus, though, is on individual agency, but we have to be careful here because individual power does not defeat systemic power. And then finally, we can have power with. Power with means that we work with our communities to find common ground even when there are differences, and we gain enough collective strength to mobilize and to win. Our problems are no longer individual or personal. We fight for and with each other because we are each other. Well, not only do we have to be aware of the forms of power that we're cultivating, but also we have to know how power is used to derail movements. This is especially true for those of us who work consistently with Black spaces, because our lives have historically been the least valued, and we're subject to some of the harshest individual, group, and state power. Remember what Frederick Douglass said: power concedes nothing without demand. But making these demands comes at a cost. We might sacrifice our careers when we reject white supremacy in the institutions where we work. Our physical freedom can be taken away when the state chooses to incarcerate opposition. We may even lose our lives. So demanding change is very risky. Those involved in movements then have to recognize and be prepared to counter the 8 intensities of power, or as we say, find your line. What you see here is a continuum of power, and it ranges from mild to medium intensity and then to high intensity. And what you'll notice is there's something called a danger zone. Once an opponent begins aggressive use of power, we're in that zone. The danger zone is where power carries significant threats to our psychological and to our physical well-being. The problem is that effective change in political movements often requires movement workers to be in the danger zone. And so it becomes even more critical for those who are doing this work to understand power relationships. So if we are clear that power is necessary to challenge systems of oppression and movement workers need to understand and then develop effective community-based power, then how can we teach them? What would be the foundation of this type of education, and will it meet the needs of those who are directly affected, those who are literally fighting for their lives? Well, when I started talking about it with other movement organizers, we were already having discussion-based workshops, and we drew from our mutual experiences. But then I started to develop things like case studies and simulations from those experiences so that people could refer to them and use them as a resource at their convenience. And from there, I worked with a software engineer to develop an interactive video game to teach power dynamics in political movements. So we have a really fun time dismantling oppressive systems. Thanks again for listening.
Thanks so much, Brandy. Our next presenter is Broderick Turner. Dr. Broderick Turner is an assistant professor of marketing at Pamplin, who joined Virginia Tech this academic year. He does innovative research on many topics, including research that considers the intersection of marketing, technology, and race. His academic research has been published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and the Journal of Marketing. This work has been featured on NPR, The Verge podcast, Vox, and many local outlets. He runs a weekly lab meeting with interdisciplinary scholars on tackling race and prejudice, called Trap Lab for short. He and his fellow trappers are pushing the boundaries on understanding how race underlies many consumer and managerial decisions. Tonight, he will talk to us about how white people have race. Broderick?
Great introduction. I feel cool. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And just give me a thumbs up. People can see it. Okay, great. So today I want to talk about some ongoing research I have with my friend Esther Dahy at Wharton on white racial identity, privilege, and social justice branding. This work is being done in our Trap Lab. So we have a weekly meeting of, I think we're up to 7 or 8 different professors around the country, a handful of graduate students at Virginia Tech, and some undergrads that are interested in this work. So this is where this work is centered. And so I want to start with this basic idea that brands, right? We can talk about Nike or Reebok, et cetera, have not been immune from the pull of these social justice movements like Black Lives Matter or #MeToo. And in response to the racial inequity that was highlighted last summer, consumer-facing brands released a slew of products, right? You might recognize this one from the NBA, but also Sprite and Nike and Reebok put messaging on products that they sold to consumers that indicated a support for these movements, right? And so the question, though, is like, if it's about social justice, if it's about like fighting against or going against the status quo of something that people perceive as unjust, then the question is, justice from what, right? And this question in particular is important because it really hasn't been considered from the group's perspective that is the racially dominant group in America, i.e. white Americans. So often in research that deals with social inequities and social justice, we center that work, especially in the market space, on Black consumers, on Hispanic consumers. But the question is, what about our white consumers? And this is important because these social justice movements come at a time when ideas about like white racial identity, like what does it mean to be a white person, are also increasing. And so we started with this basic question, which is what happens when social justice branding meets this white racial identity, right? How do they interact? What happens? Do white people, when they feel white, buy more of these social justice branded products? Do they buy less of them? And when does this happen? And so to think about this, I use a couple different theoretical frameworks. We're going to draw a bit from these ideas around critical race theory and colorblind ideology. And the basic idea is that there are psychological and material gains, right? Benefits from being at the top of any hierarchy, and in this case, being at the top of a racial hierarchy. But because the way race operates in America currently, there is a tendency for people to hold on to this colorblind ideology. And you've probably heard people say things like, I don't see race. Often this is centered around white people saying, I don't see race, I don't acknowledge race. And we'll come back to this idea about the way that white people see their race. And so one thing that could happen is that when white people think about being white, that it leads them to having concerns for more power or justifying the system that they live in or saying that the status quo is fine. And indeed, we ran a bunch of studies where when we had white people write about being white, we measured some of these things. And so it increases. It increases justifying the system. It lowers the collective guilt they feel, and it increases these conservative ideas, right? So one way to think about a white identity is that it could make people like keep the status quo, let's keep things as they are, and let's hold on to this power that we have. But whiteness in and of itself is also unearned, right? Like you were born white or you were born Black. You didn't earn that position. You didn't earn that race. That was just what you were born with. And there are these ideas in this work on systems justification that says when I have a status that is unearned, that I want to turn away from it because that means that something's wrong with the system. So if I'm getting things, benefits, psychological, et cetera, right, and I didn't earn them, right, then something is wrong with the system. And if something's wrong with the system, then we should signal things that will change the system, which are these social justice branded products. So the other way to think about it is it's possible that ideas around whiteness, what it means to a white person, could actually remind white people of their privilege, and then they decrease their justification for the system, and ultimately they want more of these social justice branded products, right? And so we put together some options for people. So we have this index of social justice products. This is an example of 7 of them, where you have one version like this peace Starbucks cup, or another version that says justice. Or we have this regular Nike Air Force One, or we have one that says unity and Black History Month Air Force Ones. Or my personal favorite, you have a Black Sabbath t-shirt, which is a great band, or their version they put out with, this is a Black Lives Matter Black Sabbath t-shirt. And so we did a bunch of experiments where we had people choose between the non-branded version of these products or the social justice brand of these products. And in the first study, we had just white Americans respond to one of 2 tweets. So they either wrote a tweet response to this Washington Post tweet that said, we're going to capitalize W in the word white. Or they responded to this other tweet that said, we're going to capitalize the letters and all these other ethnicities, but didn't mention white. All right. And then immediately after that, we said, we're testing these products. Which of these products do you prefer? All right. We didn't tell them that one was social branded or not. We just said A or B. Which one do you want? And what we see is that for white Americans, when their white identity is salient, it actually decreases their preference for these social justice branded products. All right. So this would imply thinking about being white, like gets white people to increase their justification for this system and to not want to signal that they're with this social justice branding, right? But we wanted to peer in and like see if we could code for whether or not thinking about whiteness led people to write about like how being white affected them, and if they mentioned anything about privilege. So I had some grad students that worked with me that were ignorant to the hypothesis, go through and code for these things where we either had white people write about what does your racial identity mean to you, or we had them write about their day-to-day life. And what we saw was across, I think, 3,000 people, a third of white people, when they write about their race, will mention their privilege, right? And then 2/3 say nothing about it. And what we find is when they mention their privilege, it actually increases the support for these social justice branded products. And if they don't say anything about privilege, it decreases this preference for social justice branding. And so we have this idea that there's this racial inoculation, right? Where white people have yet to deal with being white and what that means to them. What does their race mean to them? Whereas non-white people, so racialized Americans, have dealt with their race. It's already baked into their identity. And so having a Black person think about their race has less of an effect than having a white person think about their race, right? And we even asked Asian Americans, Black Americans, and white Americans, list 5 things, or 5 words that describe you, right? And then we immediately asked them, do any of these words describe your race? And white people are 4 times less likely to say a word that describes them is their race as compared to non-white people. And so what we did is that we took that same study, we had them write about, what does your racial identity mean to you, right? Or just write about your day-to-day lives. And then we had our coders go in there and code for whether or not the person said something about privilege. And what we find is a couple of things. One, white people are 7.5 times more likely, or 7.5 times more likely to say that their racial identity is privileged, right? Only about 5% of non-white Americans say that they have a privileged racial identity. And what we find, if you look at these bottom graphs here, for our non-white people, there is no effect, right, of their preference for social justice brand. They thought about what their racial identity meant. But again, for white people, when they thought about their racial identity, when they thought about privilege, it increased support, right? They wanted to go buy the Black Lives Matter jersey. They wanted to go purchase, the Black Sabbath t-shirt that read Black Lives Matter. But for those white Americans that did not talk about their privilege, it went in the opposite direction. And so there are a couple of contributions that we can take from this, right? One is that within marketing, what we're learning now is that white people do have a racial identity, and it's relatively predictable about whether that racial identity is going to make them think about justifying the system or not justifying the system, make them more conservative, less conservative. And we should understand this. And 2, in much of this work, we compare Black people or Hispanic people to our control group, and our implied control group is often white Americans. But if white people have their own reactions to race, right, treating them as this implicit control group doesn't make sense. And then there's a marketing contribution. So for my marketers out there, the way to think about this is if we're going to do these social justice branded products, right, we should really think about how we advertise them and what we say to our white consumers. My favorite example of this is P&G put out a commercial this summer that basically was like, white people, we need to do better. But what P&G did not include in this commercial was any of their brands. None of the logos popped up in this P&G commercial. And our research would suggest that might have been a good decision on their part if they weren't, they're unsure about how white people might respond to this social justice messaging that was put out. And what I want to end on is, again, this is work that's coming out of our lab. We have some awesome scholars that are actively working on this question, and these questions around, like, how does race impact all of these things? How does it impact the way that we understand marketing, the way we understand management? And so for people that own marketing companies or CMOs, bring us in or come hang out in our lab and learn some of this stuff, because we're learning it. And also, if y'all want to support some of this research, we're open. Email me, bltphd@vt.edu. That's really all I got.
Thank you, Broderick. That was terrific. Our next panelist is Dr. C.L. Bohannon, who is the Associate Director of the School of Architecture and Design, Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture, and the Faculty Principal of the Leadership and Social Change Residential College at Virginia Tech. CL's research focuses on the relationship between community engagement and design education, primarily through design for social and environmental justice. Through his research, CL works in the landscape context of community history and identity, social and environmental injustice, and community learning. His research has led to contributions to the theorization and application of community engagement in design education. He teaches courses on community engaged design research methods, contemporary research topics in landscape architecture, and seeing, understanding, and representing landscapes. CL's presentation this evening focuses on the importance of resiliency in communities. CL.
Thank you, Dean. So thank you for asking me to participate in this evening's HokieTalks session. Hopefully this will be a particular forum where we will be able to create some space for understanding as how we as citizens and as Hokies can engage with community members to help address social and environmental inequalities through our work. Tonight in particular, I will be talking about the power of storytelling and narrative in the community engagement process, and how narrative can shape the engagement process by centering voices and stories of those who have been marginalized through erasure and silence. And I will later contextualize this work through a community engagement project that our students in landscape architecture participated in earlier this semester. I start with this slide here that reads, coming post-Katrina, but the slide, I'll just read it off. Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means you can do something else to me. I am not resilient. I have a lot of conversations, with students in particular, and with this, you start to think about, questioning why communities have to be resilient in the first place, and what things have happened to them and continue to happen to them that actually affects people's lived experiences. So through that work, me as a landscape architect and a design educator, I utilize community engagement as a way to disrupt structures of power that have led to landscapes of injustice and inequality, whereby marginalized communities, where they do disproportionately more African American, Brown communities, they are affected by inequality in many different ways, and often these inequalities can also be seen through what I call uneven geographies. And some examples of that include lack of adequate housing, lack of open space, sidewalks, food insecurity, health disparities, just to name a few. And usually when you see one, you see others attached to that. And so the way that at least I approach this work, particularly with my students, I run a community engagement lab within the landscape architecture program. And through that work, the work in the lab really centers around why social and environmental justice, why does that matter in the first place? And then in what ways can we utilize community engagement to mobilize communities towards real change? And then we operationalize that work through our R3 method, which is we work with real people, that are dealing with real problems on real projects. And so that's one of the kind of the baseline things that we do as a lab in terms of foundational work. And so, as I mentioned before, in my work, exploring uneven geographies in cities and towns to better understand people's lived conditions. And I show you, this clip of this interstate system here. This is an example of an urban renewal era road project. And many of us have seen these sites, particularly, where we may have grown up or, on visits and things like that. But a lot of times, this type of road infrastructure were constructed right through African-American communities, which also leads to redlining, which is similar to urban renewal, infrastructure projects, in terms of its systemic and discriminatory practices that basically put services and in many cases, financial and otherwise, out of reach for residents of certain areas based on race and ethnicity, which then gets us to root shock, which is this is an example from 581, right in really close to campus in Roanoke. Root shock is a concept by Dr. Minnie Fullilove, and it can be explained as a traumatic stress reaction to the loss of some or all of your emotional ecosystem, and I would also add physical ecosystem to that as well. So it's the physical emotional toll that a lot of residents that have been faced with erasure and marginalization that effects that takes on people. And so through our work, and my work is really centered on stories and why stories matter. How do you get out of kind of how people talk about where you're from and the narratives about who you are, right? And so it's my personal belief that memories, through photographs, newspaper headlines, all that stuff brings streets back to life, memorable stories that, they really inform us of who we are today. It also helps us recall the vitality of our past, and also helps us propel in terms of world building and building our future. And so within this, story is a process of personal empowerment. And in that process, collective action and change. But it's really important to really question who's telling the story, right? And then within the narratives and storytelling, telling your one story is really liberating, and that is anchored within people's lives. In that sense, then it makes it move forward, I should say, in terms of who gets to decide whose stories to tell, right? And so that gets to the power of community narratives and who owns the stories to put forward. And so within this, also with disruptive engagement, I also like to use storytelling and narrative as a form of disruption. And so with narrative as a form of disruption, it's a concept, right, that that looks at power and oppression, and it provides a platform for tangible applications to support people's efforts to resist harmful stories about their lives, the othering that sometimes happen in stories, or the stories that are told about people. And so this is where community narratives can be, and they many times are, counter narratives, right? So narratives of hope, narratives about family, narratives of pain, narratives of joy, again, that gets us towards narratives of future imaginaries about our communities. And it's really important through this process of using narrative as a disruption and also using engagement, that people themselves see themselves thriving and a part of a process in creating future worlds, and particularly with design, because often design is not something that's readily available to everyday people. It's seen as something that is out of reach. And so engagement puts design processes right in the hands of those who need it the most. And so I would like to take a few moments to contextualize, this work of narrative and why it's important to understand community identity. I'll take you to Allegheny County, which is about 2 hours away from campus, and to the community of Wrightsville, which is Allegheny County's only remaining African-American community, and our friend of our program and just complete rock star Dolores Quarles, who's the main community organizer there reached out to us and said, hey, we have this project. She explained a little bit about Wrightsville, and our students took this on in January. So I'm going to walk you through some of the work that happened there. But the story with Wrightsville, it starts at the Allen McElwee plantation, where Archie and Mary Wright were once enslaved. And then, after emancipation, they moved about 10 miles away in what's now on the edge of Covington there in Allegheny County. And they started Wrightsville. And of course, at the time, at its heyday, up to somewhere between 50 and 70 families made Wrightsville home. But part of, much like in Roanoke, and much like the narrative I told you about the urban renewal era infrastructure, the construction of Interstate 64 completely erased half of Wrightsville. And so this is the plat from VDOT that shows what's in white are the plats and then the homes that were raised through. Here's the actual road bed that was constructed, so you can see where the removal took place. And here's what Wrightsville would have been today. You can see that the area to the north is pretty much what's left of Wrightsville. So you have about 10 to 12 families that are there. I mean, complete erasure through their construction of Interstate 64. And so you're left with this very small hamlet almost left there. But where they're small, they're mighty and like love and joy and kind for their community. So our students were brought in January to start this charrette process that we do every year, and a lot of it, was done over Zoom. We had a small group of students to travel to do some site visits, but all of it was about stories, about narratives, about where the diaspora, where people have moved to from Wrightsville, the stories of why people stayed, narratives of homecoming, that's kind of an annual thing where people come home and they have a blues festival, or sorry, not blues, a jazz festival, and they have a wine tasting and a few other activities there. So students were able to utilize a lot of those concepts about play and being in the street to really revitalize and come up with these ideas to reimagine from the narratives that are provided by the community members a new world for the community of Wrightsville. You can see the images here using what is the Golden Era Plaza, which is the place where they have a local restaurant and outdoor spaces to attract people into the community, providing spaces where people can just hang out and be and relax, which is another piece of the narrative that came out of the stories of people remembering this area that they used to call the Ponderosa, which was kind of on the edge of the community. And then how do you actually bring that back in something that is more of a formal structure as a landscape element. And then, also, going back in the story, students did a very, very good job in this particular group. Were very brave with, tackling the erasure of the community along US 60 and Interstate 64. And in this particular group, they said, we're going to take back at least part of the median and the highway, so people know that they're actually driving through Wrightsville. So even just taking small moments like that to bring awareness of place and that there are things that have happened negatively to this community, and we don't need to forget what those processes have done, right? And then one of the really compelling pieces here is also with family narratives, and looking at the families, the anchor families of the community, and students developed a concept to attach flowers to the family names, pairing almost like family lineages with flowers that can be utilized as cuttings to share, And also you have a rhythm of when things would be in bloom, which also can show up in terms of stories and narrative in an overall landscape. And so I want to end with that and be happy to answer questions later, but I also want to acknowledge all the students in our program that participated in this charrette and say thank you to them and their hard work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, CL. So I invite the audience to submit questions using the Q&A button, and I will facilitate these questions. We have a couple already, but while you are populating others, I'd like to pose a question to all three presenters. What is the role of higher education to shape society's understanding of and action in the area of racial equity? Anyone want to take a first stab at that?
I'll answer. I think it's a very complicated question. To be honest, most days my answer is stay as far away from marginalized communities as possible. And I say that because higher ed as an institution often replicates the same harmful power dynamics that we see in broader society. And we have yet to deal with that. So there is potential, to be sure, but we need to make sure that we get it right first and that we work hard within higher ed to increase our own understanding before we try to teach others.
Thank you, Brandy. CL, Broderick, anything to add?
I have a pretty straightforward view on this, right? And I'm going to use the word us. And when I'm saying us, y'all know who us is. The university system and academia wasn't built for us. It was built by us and it was built on us. And my view is that higher ed owes us. And it is higher education's responsibility, if they're going to actually be a higher education, to pay back what they owe. Right. So as a land grant university like Virginia Tech owes, right? As a university that didn't have a Black student until the 60s, Virginia Tech owes, right? And it's not just Virginia Tech, this is basically every American university. Like, people are owed, and it's our responsibility as academics, as administrators, as alumni, to like use the university's resources to pay back what they owe. So,
CL?
Sure. Yeah, I was going to, Roger, I agree with you 100%. I do think, I always think for me, I'm just contextualizing this through landscape architecture, my lens. I feel like I have an obligation as a Black landscape architect in higher education that's an educator to attempt to pay back to communities that have been marginalized through the actions through my profession as a one lens. And then you think higher education on top of that as well. So if I can use engagement to get students to work with folks who are unlike themselves, to maybe start to understand that, through difference, there are some ways that we can work together. And I can challenge the notion of what design has been in the past to make a a better world for for society, but also change the way future landscape architects, future designers think about what world making and space making can be, where it can be more equitable. I feel like I have an obligation to do that because I know my educational system all the way through was not that way. And so it takes a while for you to be able to question and have the power to say, we need to disrupt and change. So I do definitely think we have an obligation on higher education. We must be doing more. We have to.
Thank you. So a question from the Q&A from the audience, directed at Brandy. Is the video game available to the public?
No, it's not. It's only available to the people who are enrolled in my trainings because it's part of a holistic approach to understanding this very important aspect of movements. So if you want to sign up, just let me know, and then you can have access.
Great. How do you see this radicalized marketing having impact on the community and political organizing that Dr. Faulkner discussed? Has consumerism influenced our activism?
I think like both me and Brandon tackle this one together. So my view on marketing, the reason I study marketing, right, is that like everything's for sale in the US. And like capitalism will commoditize anything. And it has turned its eye onto these social movements without necessarily like supporting the social movement. So you could see like specifics of this, like people selling t-shirts with Breonna Taylor's face on it, right? Was the Breonna Taylor family getting proceeds from this? For most of them, no. Right. And so, like, you know, if the question is, has consumerism influenced our activism? Probably not. Has activism influenced our consumerism? 100,000%. Right. And, you know, like this is why these slogans end up on t-shirts. This is why you can buy a, you know, hashtag girl boss, me too, Black Lives Matter tee basically anywhere. And so like I'll just answer my end, and Brandy can tell us has consumerism influenced activism, but the other direction's clear that yes, activism is 100% influencing consumerism.
Brandy?
I would second that. And this is a conversation that we do have a whole lot in movements, because we recognize that, as Broderick said, where there's a buck to be made, somebody's going to try to make it. But it can be very harmful, because sometimes it leads us to think that there's such a quick and easy fix that, okay, if I just put my shirt on, then I have somehow miraculously changed somebody's life. Or if I buy these products, that the money actually goes to the people who need it most. And most often that's just not the case. So I agree with that. The consumerism around activism can be very, very frustrating.
How do the inherent racism and structural inequality in the academy limit the ability of the university to have real impact on these issues?
Universities don't exist. There's no such thing as university, right? There's buildings. There is like logos, but a university is its people, right? And so like structural inequality is just thousands and thousands of decisions that people make every day. And so like, as a member of the academy, I'm a professor, you know, it's my job to make better decisions so that this whole system turns around. And I don't think that's going to happen today. But the more people that are in the system that see it as a bunch of decisions that point in one direction, you know, I don't think that universities themselves are inherently racist, right? People have made these decisions and we have built these systems that are now inherently racist. They don't have to be. And so like, I don't think there's any limit to what the university can do. Like we have a ton of resources. We have a lot of money that flow into these university systems. We have huge donations. We have awesome donors. Like we can do a lot. And I believe that like, you know, we're walking in that direction. The fact that you got me, Brandy, and CL here that are like moving this stuff forward and studying it, like we're making these choices. And I think Virginia Tech is at least trying to make some of these good choices. But again, it's people, right? So it's all the individual people making better choices. And so like the fact that we have a huge diverse audience that's listening to this now and asking like, what can I do, right? How can I support this, right? Like you can also just make better decisions, make less racism, support reparations, hire Black people, right? Like these are all things that we can do as individuals that will, I think, eat away and turn the ship around. But that's me being super optimistic today.
Mhm.
Ask me tomorrow, it's going to be way more cynical.
Brandy or CL, anything to add? Okay. A compliment for CL here. CL's Dr. Bohannon's work reminds me of Robert Caro's Power Broker, conveying the history of Robert Moses and the agencies he controlled, carving up so many communities in the New York area with highways. I really appreciate the Virginia local studies and projects you're doing to reclaim similar interstate construction running over communities and breaking them up. How do you align stay away with Virginia Tech O's? I know several Black organizations in the area are afraid to work with Virginia Tech because of consistent experiences with losing materials, access to products, and control of their own narrative. Is it possible to overcome this?
I think it's a great question, and I echo that sentiment. I as well know many in communities who want nothing to do with VT because of the experiences that they've had through that imbalance of power as they've engaged. So I think there is a way to reconcile it, but you have to understand that it's a long process. And sometimes what happens is that we're so willing in communities to give up our self-determination and have others say, here it is. And we have to push back on that quite a bit. And yes, there are things that are owed. Yes, there are things that institutions like VT can and should do, but the community has to first decide what it actually wants. What is it that we're trying to achieve? What's the goal? Why do you want these institutions to be engaged? So until we can answer those questions, I think we'll be headed still in the wrong direction.
I also like to add to that too. Sometimes with engagement, it's about your starting point and how you're working with, and also a lot of times, people practice engagement, and it can be a very extractive process where people come in and they take and take and take, and that means they're not listening to. I'm echoing Brandy here, what the community actually has identified that they need, and it's more about, let me work with you, and I'm gonna extract this out, I'm going to write my paper, stuff sits on the shelf, and the community is in the same situation. So you do have to have a longitudinal look at when you work with communities. It cannot be this one-off. It is a commitment, and you have to be ready to do so.
Can you help white people understand the us? And more important, how may white people help who truly want to help? And I would add to that, what can we do as alumni to support you in all your efforts?
I'll give some specifics. One, if you're interested in like learning more about this research that we're doing in marketing management on race and racism, shoot me an email. You can come like hang out at our lab or invite us in so we can like talk to your company or your business. Two, like research isn't cheap. And like the work that CL and Brandy are doing and myself, it's expensive. It takes a lot of resources, right? It is expensive in time and money and energy. So as alumni, like throw some money at the problem. That's something that you can do. And whenever anyone mentions reparations, say, yes, I support it. So I'm just giving you some concrete things you can start doing like right now.
I'm afraid we've reached the end of a very scintillating hour of presentations and conversations, and I have 18 other questions I could have asked, but I'm afraid we're out of time. And so I'll turn it back to Debbie.
Thank you all so very much for this evening. This has been just absolutely wonderful. We appreciate all of your time. It looks like we've just scratched the surface. And with so many other questions, we will do our best to try to combine some of these and to respond back in a follow-up to you. So we're definitely not ignoring you. But I do want to thank all of you, all of the participants tonight, Broderick and Brandy and CL. I'd like to thank our partners in university relations and special events who helped put this program on. We have a great partnership. A special thanks to the colleges tonight for helping, the College of Architecture and Urban Studies, Pamplin College of Business, and the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. Thank you for joining us. Happy spring, everybody. It's going to be in the 70s here in the next few days, and we hope to see you next year as we begin our sesquicentennial celebration, and our HokieTalks program will lean into that pretty heavily. And have a good evening. Go Hokies.